evening and welcome to Footscray Community Arts Centre. I acknowledge that the event this evening is taking place on the traditional lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation and offer our respects to the elders of these traditional lands and through them and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, past, present and emerging. I acknowledge with respect Yorta Yorta woman Karen Jackson, who is speaking on this panel this evening, and local Muri Muri, Yorta Yorta and Bunurong Wemba Wemba woman Marie Clark, a wonderful local artist who is here in the audience this evening. I'm Bernadette Fitzgerald, the Head of Programming here at Footscray Community Arts Centre, and I welcome you here on behalf of our Director and CEO, Martin Payton. Martin is sadly unable to be here this evening, so I'm hoping to channel him at some stage. I extend this welcome from Martin, along with the FCAC board members that are here in the audience tonight, and also our chair. I also welcome the team from Time Out, our co-presenters, the panel members, and you, especially the audience that have come along and to share in this important conversation tonight. Upon reflecting on saying a few words, I was delighted to note that the G word, or that gentrification word, could be defined as the process of making a person or activity more refined or polite. I wondered how that sat with Footscray Community Arts Centre and you, the community, that have gathered here this evening to maybe reflect and enter into the very important conversation that will happen tonight. Personally, my over 2 years, decades of working here at Footscray Community Arts Centre really has not been defined by, or defined or refined really, defined by being refined or polite activity as a priority. Footscray Community Arts Centre is a vital life force of arts and culture and critical conversations and exciting new developments in the Australian cultural landscape. We really are a unique place of learning and sharing where the dynamic between community, culture and contemporary art is explored and celebrated. Through our work and ambitions, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, artists, and very importantly, our elders, both the elders in residence here at Footscray Community Arts Centre, are positioned as critical to the history and future of Australia's cultural landscape and identity, and therefore in our role as Australia's leading community engaged and contemporary arts centre. At FCAC, as we shorten our name, the community is synonymous with contemporary arts practice. Authorship and self-determined practice are central to the ways in which we engage with and deliver our work. It's a seamless intersection between people, program, and place. Place is what we will unpack tonight, but all of them have a relationship and work together to create the extraordinary things that we do here in the name of art and culture. We were established 44 years ago, and in 1974, really to provide opportunities for participation in the arts, especially for the people of Melbourne's West, with a very clear agenda of access by all. We continue to focus today with that same lens. It hasn't changed in 44 years. We really look at what are all the platforms of diversity that need to be represented and, very importantly, to be platformed here at the Footscray Community Arts Centre. In the Footscray and Maribyrnong local government area, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up about 0.5% of the population. 40% of the residents were not born in Australia, and 42% speak a language other than English at home. And there are 150 different languages and cultural groups. We view the changing landscape of Footscray, cultural, economic and demographic, as a continual process. What is important for FCAC is how we do to continue to hold a space for the changing and sometimes conflicting values of our community. Footscray Community Arts Centre is a place where people strongly identify a sense of belonging. What are the needs of the community moving in? How will a change precinct create opportunities for a diversity of people to feel that they belong? Importantly, and perhaps most importantly, how are we a culturally safe place for the community in all its diversity? And that will always begin First Nations first. FCAC is a place where softer voices and stories are platformed and, most importantly, amplified. I'd like to now introduce Cass Nuttleton, the editor of Time Out Melbourne, and I very much look forward to the conversation ahead, and thank you for attending.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Cass Knowlton and I'm the editor of Time Out Melbourne. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Time Out is very excited to be co-presenting this talk on gentrification in partnership with Footscray Community Arts Centre. We've collaborated on this project from the beginning to create a space for this critical conversation. I'll just explain how the evening will go a little bit. There'll be a 45-minute panel discussion followed by a 30-minute intermission for you to grab something to eat, get a drink, and have some conversations with the panelists and each other about the things that we're talking about tonight. After that, we'll come back in here for another 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. We encourage you to stick around till 9:30 if you wish, and make sure you stop by Italian food truck just like Nonna's outside to enjoy paninis, parmigianas, and their own take on a snack pack, which is, I believe, like a bolognese on chips. Sounds delicious. Drinks are available at the FCAC bar, which is at the front, so make sure you visit the bar during intermission and after the event is over. And should you need them, the toilets are down that passage and just out to the right. So I would like to thank the Footscray Community Arts Centre, just like Nonna's, and each one of our wonderful panelists for participating in what I know is going to be a fantastic event. And now I'd like to hand over to our host for the evening, Sonia Nair. Sonia is the General Manager of Human Rights Media Organisation Right Now, and she's a writer and critic whose work has appeared in Kill Your Darlings, SBS, The Big Issue, and other publications. Please welcome Sonia.
Thanks so much, Kaz. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Yes. As Kaz said, I'm Sonia Nair, and I'll be chairing today's conversation called The Gentrification of Footscray. Before we begin, I would also like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and pay my respects to the elders of any other communities who may be with us today. The land on which we meet on always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We have an eclectic mix of people on our panel today. Each of them have either lived, worked, or created, or they do all three in the Inner West and in Footscray specifically. Today they'll shed light on how residents, businesses, cultural institutions and government can work together to preserve the character of Footscray in amongst the many changes it's undergoing, and they'll also outline their vision for Footscray of the future. I'll start with my introductions. To my extreme left is Izzy Huntington. You can tell from her jersey who she is, I'm pretty sure, but a Western Bulldogs superstar. Izzy suffered a severe knee injury during a game against the Lions this year, but she is still pursuing her AFLW dream. She wants to pursue a career in medicine and is balancing her studies with footy. Right next to Izzy is Karen. Karen Jackson is a Yoda Yoda woman and director of the Moondani Balluk Indigenous Academic Unit at Victoria University in Footscray. She writes with a guiding aim to create an environment that welcomes, nurtures and recreates community based on the relationship to land, culture, law and elders. She is on the Footscray Community Arts Centre board and a member of its Indigenous advisory group and has lived and worked in Footscray for almost 2 decades. Right in the middle there we have Steve Kimonides. Steve is a barbecue specialist who lives in Footscray and has chosen the next door suburb of Kingsville as a site for his restaurant Burn City Test Kitchen. Steve was sommelier at CBD Italian institution Il Baccaro before he decided to turn his passion for barbecue into his career. Second from the right is Alan Pert. Alan is director of the Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne and an acclaimed architect. He is a partner in the Invisible College project funded by the British Arts and Humanities Resource Centre, which brings together academics, policymakers, artists and local people to tackle issues of regeneration, conservation and education. Closest to me and lastly is Santilla Chingaipe. Santilla is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker who has worked for SBS World News for more than a decade. Her work explores contemporary migration, cultural identities and politics. She writes for the Saturday paper and she's also a member of the federal government's advisory board on Oz-Africa relationships. Please put your hands together and make our panellists feel welcome. So as Cass mentioned, our panel will be divided into 2 parts. The first part will go from now until 7:15. You guys will have half an hour to grab a drink, food, and then we'll come back for 45 minutes, after which you guys will have 15 minutes to ask audience questions. Some of you may have submitted audience questions during the registration process. Many of those questions will be reflected in our discussion today. And apart from that, feel free to follow the discussion on Twitter. Footscray Arts will be live tweeting at their handle Footscray Arts, and I believe Time Out Melbourne also will be at Time Out Mel. So kind of building on what Bernadette said, I think it's important to foreground this conversation with the fact that Footscray has undergone a continuous process of transformation and has such a rich cultural legacy underpinning it. For thousands of years, Footscray was the meeting place of the Kulin Nation. Waves of migration started with the colonisation of the British, and then the White Australia policy and the relaxation of it caused Greeks and Italians to migrate to Footscray in the 1950s, while the complete disbandment of the White Australia policy led to the migration of Vietnamese people. The 1990s and the 2000s have seen the arrival of new entrants from Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea and South Sudan, and so comes to be the Footscray that many people live in today. Keeping in mind this rich tapestry of experiences that Footscray encapsulates, I kind of wanted to start the panel touching on your personal experiences of living and working in Footscray. Karen, I thought I would start with you because you've spent almost 2 decades living and working in the West. Could you tell us how the Footscray of today is different to the one that you moved to all those years ago?
Yeah, I guess that makes me the oldest on the panel, by the way. So old. So when I actually moved to Altona, when I first moved into the West, way back in '95. So yeah, it has been a long time since I've been in the West. And from there I went to Newport and then to Seddon, which is close. I called it Footscray because, anyway, there's a whole story behind that. And then moved to Footscray and now live in Maribyrnong. And when I first started work at the university, we were at St Albans, which was, also another part of the West. And I'm also involved in the Aboriginal community in Wyndham and know a mob of people who live in the West, including Marie. And now I feel really bad because I didn't do acknowledgement, all that sort of stuff, and tell you who I am, and I'm meant to do all that because I'm a black fella, but anyway, I won't take up all that space. I'll stop waffling on in a minute. So for me, Footscray, specifically Footscray as its own space, for me, Footscray is this place, is Footscray Community Arts Centre. And it's the place that brings together Aboriginal people, blackfellas, not just from the western suburbs, but also people from across the river. We quite often joke to the blackfellas when they come across the river, they're not meant to go back, they stay here and those sorts of things. But this is a place, I think, that enables Aboriginal people to do placemaking, and that's important for our cultural connections. The ability to sort of be a group and be self-determining and to be sovereign in a place is vitally important, and Footscray Community Arts Centre enables that for the Aboriginal people of Footscray and its surrounds. And so what has changed, I guess, in that space is us pushing into and back against Footscray Community Arts Centre, even though it was welcoming, but them understanding what it meant to create that space for Aboriginal people, to make it safe for us, to make it culturally relevant. And I think that's the beauty of Footscray Community Arts Centre, that they have enabled that for us. And then we've grown an Indigenous program here through the Indigenous Advisory Group, and we have Women Jika each year, which is a really beautiful space as well, and that reconnects us back into this space. There's a whole set of other things, I guess, that happened in Footscray. For people who don't know, my great-uncle William Cooper moved to Footscray from Yorta Yorta country when he was 70 years old, which is pretty amazing, and did the walk from Footscray to the Jewish Museum as part of Crystal Night, and did a petition to the Queen, saying they needed to intervene in Germany's treatment of the Jews. That's another part of Footscray which has a deep history and a deep connection for Aboriginal people who come into this space. Great Auntie Sally Russell, also lived in this space, and so that's another connection for us. There's a number of Aboriginal women that used to work at Kinnear's rope factory and in the meat factories and those sorts of things. So coming into Footscray and understanding those connections and the people who are here also gives us that culturally safe space in which we can gather and understand who we are. The other space it's actually Maribyrnong, I guess, is the Living Museum of the West. And early days when I moved into this space, they had like the Curry gardening team, and they were doing some really great work around trying to establish an Aboriginal organisation in the West, and that thing around, so which is also around cultural safety and cultural spaces and placemaking, and we have still yet to create a sustainable community-controlled Aboriginal organisation in the West, which then brings me back to Footscray Community Arts Centre and why it's so important that this is an open space for Aboriginal people. I'll stop waffling now. That's my story of Footscray and bits and pieces.
Oh, that was amazing. Thank you, Karen. Santilla, I might move on to you, because you have been in the West for 7 years, I believe, and 3 years of which have been in Footscray, although you also are in Seddon now, which is Footscray.
Footscray,
Yeah.
yeah.
Can you
It is Footscray.
It is. Can you tell us more about what has changed in your 7 years in the West?
Oh, it's become less affordable. Part of the reason why when I moved to Footscray, I was living in a share house with friends, and we were living in this beautiful Victorian house on Cowper Street, and we were forced to move because the owner decided to sell, and I think that's just the story of Footscray now. And we couldn't find anywhere that we could afford to live in a house, and so we all sort of went our separate ways. And I loved the connections I'd made in my time in Footscray that I didn't want to move. I couldn't imagine living anywhere that didn't give me that close proximity to Footscray, and so I moved to Yarraville, and I kind of didn't like it that much. And then thankfully I was able to find a place in Seddon, and that's where I am now. And it's just I don't know. I mean, for me, Footscray, it does multiple things for me. I mean, I use Footscray. One, it helps with my work. A lot of what I explore with my journalism and my documentary work ties in with some of the changes and things that are happening in Footscray. A lot of the social issues that I explore are very, very visible in Footscray, and I like that it doesn't shy away from a lot of that sort of stuff. But then also, I love the people in Footscray. I don't think that there's anywhere in this. I mean, I find it incredible that you can have people from, geographically different places of the world living right next door to each other or working next to each other. Like, you've got Vietnam, and you've got the Horn of Africa, and I just cannot think of anywhere else where you can kind of get that proximity. But then also what it does for, I think a lot about democracy, obviously, but I think about what it does in terms of our sense of empathy and how we see each other, and it's just great that a lot of the barriers that sometimes are formed and are kind of broken in Footscray, because we're constantly interacting with people that are very different from ourselves or how we grew up, and I just think it's such a beautiful thing. So yeah, so I do like Footscray for that reason, and a whole host of other reasons.
Alan, so you're currently working on the realisation of a precinct plan, I believe, with the Footscray Community Arts Centre. Could you tell us more about this plan and what changes in the community you've observed, and I guess how you're working to resolve that or counter some of the changes that are happening?
Yep, so I'm probably the one in the panel that's not got the deepest connection into Footscray. So this week is 6 years I've been in Melbourne, and as you can tell, I came from Glasgow, back in Scotland, where I trained as an architect. And I think importantly, just to put that in a context, I mean, I grew up in the west of the city, in a town probably better known for its shipbuilding, building huge cruise liners, Singer sewing machine factory. So it was an industrial town, about 35 minutes outside Glasgow. And watched the rapid decline of that town during Thatcher's time, which I could spend 3 hours probably talking about. So I'm a victim of that period of change in Glasgow, watching a place really, the whole social context and community infrastructure of a place completely destroyed through the decline of industry with no contingency. And I think part of that fueled my passion for the built environment and the role that can play in communities. So I studied architecture in Glasgow, moved to Berlin in 1990, just after the wall came down, and watched another city go through a completely different transformation, good and bad. And it's a city I fell in love with. I mean, Berlin was just the most amazing place to be because of that transformation it was going through. I spent 3 years there, and it's been a city I've gone back to a lot with students and on my own, and I've watched some really tragic changes happen through policy, which I'll probably touch on a bit more tonight, because I think there's a lot of parallels with what's happening here in Melbourne. I think Berlin's probably, globally, one of the most unique places in relation to gentrification. And I think it touches on the whole complexity of the word gentrification. I think it's a very difficult, it's a terminology born out of the 1970s, and I think we need to be very careful about how we use it in relation to place. But fast forward, I worked in Olympic Park before coming to Melbourne, and again watched 6 years of change, probably 30 years of development squashed into 6 years, and again seen some really positive changes that happened in some of the boroughs around Olympic Park, and some really tragic community change as well that happened, which I might touch on tonight. But I came to Melbourne to help establish the Melbourne School of Design at the university. I came here because it was one of the few universities around the world that had a School of Architecture embedded in a much broader faculty looking at planning, urban design, construction, property. So having all of those disciplines under one roof, it's not a School of Design or Architecture isolated. And I think that's one of the important issues, is we've got too many disciplines that are disparate, and you see it playing out in real life. And I think you can see it in places like Footscray, that lack of integration between design, policy making, and urban thinking. So about a year ago, I gave a talk about some of the changes that are going on in Melbourne. I talk about it as someone who I still sees a bit of a tourist here, and some of the things that I was perceiving as problematic in terms of growth and issues of growth. And someone that was on the board of the Arts Centre invited me to come to the Arts Centre in Footscray and engage in a conversation about Footscray as a place and some of the challenges with growth up here. And that's evolved, that conversation's grown. And tonight, really, the reason I think I'm here is to publicly announce that we are embarking on what we're calling a precinct plan, but I think we need to be careful with that as well.
Sorry for stealing your thunder and including that in my question. Yeah. I didn't realise you hadn't launched it yet, the precinct plan.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think there's a chance to basically say that we are about to embark on this precinct plan, and the only way it's going to work is if we get public buy-in and we engage people like the audience. And it's I think it's going to become a really significant tool within the community. It's much more than the Arts Centre. It's about Footscray. But one of the things we're trying to do is understand what is happening. I don't think anybody really fully understands it. There's buildings going up that nobody has any control over. We don't understand visually what the streetscapes are going to look like. We don't understand socially what the demographics are going to be. If you consider that in 1991, there was a population of about 12,000 in Footscray. I think you've added 6,000 in 25 years. Over the next 25 years, you're about to add another 32. How do you deal with that? And what are we building to accommodate that? I don't think it's appropriate what we're building. And I think there's a really important conversation to have about the relevance of what's out there in the streets. And I think there's a really positive opportunity to change it. So one of the things we're looking to do through this precinct plan is open up a dialogue with state government, local government, look at some of the broader regeneration that's going on and try and influence it and have an impact on it. For the benefit of the Arts Centre, but more broadly for the benefit of the community.
Great, thank you, Ellen. That really sets up our conversation really well. Steve, you moved to the West in a similar time frame to Santilla, I believe in 2012.
Yep.
Can you tell us a bit about the transformations you've seen, also specifically from being a hospitality venue owner at the moment?
I'll start at the start of my first memories of Footscray. And that would be in the early 80s when my dad used to take me to the footy games at the Western Oval. So I grew up in Carlton. I was born in the late 70s and through the 80s, grew up in Carlton. And some of my earliest memories of coming to Footscray were connected with the VFL at the time. And so as a Carlton supporter going to a Footscray game, it wasn't that welcoming. But, you're a little kid. Moving on from that, I think some memories that which I cast my mind to about Footscray, particularly in the early 90s, was the movie Romper Stomper. I'm sure some people would identify with that, and the image Footscray was given through that film and through that, through the eyes of that. And there's some of the comparisons we can draw. Some of my ideas of Footscray before I moved here. Moving here in 2012, a lot of my experiences are through what I have tasted. And by that I mean my experiences through Footscray Market, through exploring the restaurants within the Vietnamese community, the African restaurants, and seeing how the different pubs and those social spaces. The pub through Melbourne is a pub itself is something on the corner. It's an institution where people get together. The word is public. And seeing the changes, Hart's Hotel, the Plough Hotel, and experiencing those, and how the community has come together in those spaces, I can see the change through that. But the things I'd like to hold on to are some of the great flavours that you taste through the Vietnamese restaurants and the African restaurants and those businesses that have been here for 15 years plus. And I think it's very important that they stay here. So if you're good, it's important, when I say you're good, if those restaurants are good and the food they're serving is great, it's important they get that recognition. My other experiences at Footscray, I ride a bike a lot, a push bike. It's quite a flat area, Footscray, once you come up Hopkins Street. It's easy to get around. So riding up the Maribyrnong, riding down Barclay Street, riding down Sunshine Road, riding down Williamstown Road, along the rivers, through Yarraville, a lot of my experiences through the West are, on my push bike and what I see. So we can expand on those things.
Thank you, Steve. I think the effects of gentrification are small and large, and I thought we'd go into... I think all of us come from very different positions, and I know there's a definition for gentrification, but I wanted to ask each of you what gentrification means to you. Can we start with you, Izzy?
Yeah, sure. So just a bit of background, I'm sort of relatively new to the Footscray area, so unlike most of the panellists here, haven't spent much time in the area, but I was drafted last year to the football club and sort of immediately felt this connection with the suburb that was so incredible and something that I don't think I would have felt at another football club, and I think that's the result of the diversity and the inclusion that Footscray embodies and the way that the suburb and the people of Footscray and the people of the inner west go about things. So for me, in terms of the gentrification of Footscray in this area, I think compared to other suburbs that Brunswick, your Fitzroys that have undergone it really quickly, I think that this sort of area has quite well held on to what the things that they really love about Footscray, and they've held on to the diversity and the multiculturalism quite well in that way. And I think that's something that we, as a community and as the people of Footscray really need to try and hold on to in the face of gentrification. And there are positives of it as well, but I think as we've heard, it's got such an amazing, rich history and it's a beautiful space and with beautiful people. So I think, as best we can, we need to sort of hold on to what Footscray really means to us and hold out on the sort of negative impacts that gentrification can bring.
Would one of you like to expand on how you approach gentrification and what it means to Footscray and to you personally?
I guess, will I? All right. Sorry, I'm an old person, I just jump in. Got a lot. Anyway, so I think I'm really unsure what gentrification really means, and I did find a really early definition around gentrification, which actually talked about invasion, and then taking over and changing and renewal and dispossession, which sort of hit home to a Yorta woman in terms of what has happened to the traditional owners in this space. But so in terms of gentrification, I'm really confused about whether, so for me, I sort of see Yarraville and Seddon as places where gentrification happens, where people come, or even West Footscray, Clive Street, West Footscray, where everybody redoes the houses in that street. And people come in and buy them, and they're beautiful, and people like me can't afford them. But what I see in Footscray is this whole set of major apartment high-rise density things, which I'm not sure that that's gentrification, but yeah, I'm sure other people will talk about that. So for me, gentrification is a confusing sort of space. Yeah.
Me?
I think about gentrification, one, just through, basically just from the working definition, which is just, I guess, when you have the socioeconomics of an area change because people that have wealth move in essence, just essentially sanitizing a suburb that was once diverse in terms of the social economics of it. But the way I look at it is that I look at it in I think academics have sort of looked at gentrification through the waves of gentrification, because gentrification doesn't just happen overnight, it's not at once. And one of the things that I find interesting about gentrification in Footscray is what I like to think of it as that first wave of gentrification, where you've got young people moving in, where you've got restaurants and cafes opening up, where you do have development, early stages of development happening with all the apartments and all that sort of stuff. So that definitely is a movement of people into an area that ordinarily didn't live in this area. These are people that have come in with money, are able to create things in the area, and in some ways, change things up and make things a little bit more exciting, a little bit more fresh for an area that perhaps was, long needed that, and with that creates jobs and all that sort of stuff. And then the second part of that is when you then get very, very wealthy people then seeing all those sort of cleaning up things that have been done by that first wave, and then they come in and then they just buy up all of that, and then what you tend to see is that you then have the demographic being incredibly homogenized, and so anyone that was able to live or work or rent in that area can no longer live or rent or work in that area, and it just becomes pretty much like Toorak, and it can't really not to bag Toorak.
Can I pray it never becomes
Yes.
like Toorak or South Yarra?
Yeah, but and that's kind of how I sort of see it, and I think it was touched on before, just how when you look at it from a global perspective, there are cities that you can look to sort of see how they try to manage gentrification, and cities where it actually did go really, really wrong. And I think it's definitely a timely thing that we're having this conversation in Footscray, and I'm certainly very, very excited by this precinct plan that you talked about, and I think that's such a great thing in terms of how we think about how we manage gentrification. But that's how I look at gentrification. I look at it in those two sorts of ways, and how wealth, which essentially that's what it is, has an impact on the demographics, and what that then does for people that come to these places. And for Footscray, the thing that makes Footscray unique from any other suburb in this city that has experienced forms of gentrification is that Footscray is the only one post the Second World War that has seen every wave of migration lay its roots here. And the concern for me is what happens for the future waves of migration. Where do they lay their roots? Where do they start little businesses? Where do they have the support services that other groups have had over the decades? And I think these are things that we should be thinking about, going forward, because, do we want a situation where it's like Paris, where you have people pushed out into these ghettos, and so we're not thinking about these social problems the way that we should, because it's just out of sight, out of mind. So yeah, that's how I think about gentrification.
Alan, could you tell us more about why you think the term gentrification is out of date, and what you were expanding on before?
Look, I just think it's a very contested area. I mean, it was invented by academics in the 1970s. It was, I think, appropriated by many cities around the world for about 20 years as a positive. So it was this view of urban renewal through gentrification. So there was this whole swathe of neighbourhood plans produced, and every mayor of every city would rather have the problem of gentrification than decline. So there's that baggage, I think, that comes with it. I think that the issue with gentrification now is that it's so varied, and you can see it here in Melbourne. You've got tourist gentrification, you get family gentrification. I think Melbourne, probably more than any other city I've ever been in, you've got school gentrification. You've got a ridiculous problem in Melbourne where the school you go to become some kind of status.
There's also a lot of white flight, I think, from inner city suburbs that are now where migrants are going to. There are a lot of white populations moving out.
Yeah, but that's,
and
you're
going
getting
to different
gentrification
schools.
of the suburbs because, I mean, you know, when you see a Coles regenerating on a high street, you know, it's for a reason. They're suddenly investing, and you know, Coles building apartments now. You know, you go down even as far as Mentone and places like that, and you're starting to see incredible gentrification of those places. You know, the coffee shop, you know, the high street changing dramatically, and some of these is again, it's to do with affordability. People think it's a safe family place to go, but they're changing dramatically. So I think there's different types of gentrification going on here. I think in terms of what it means to me, I mean, I think at one extreme, it's about, if you're looking at the negatives, it's about loss of identity. It's about homogenisation. And I think you can see that on your doorstep. You know, why are you building apartments like you're building on your doorstep? They've got absolutely no relevance to the Australian climate. They've got no relevance to the street. They've got no relevance to your demographic mix in terms of families, in terms of single person. You know, if you look at I mean, London is a good example. London didn't have a strong rental market. In the last 10 years, the biggest growth has been is co-living because of a young generation that cannot go on the property market. We are not addressing that anywhere in Melbourne, co-living at that scale. So I don't think we're responding to the specific demographic context or cultural context at all. And I'm saying that in a broad brush right across Melbourne. I think we've got a huge problem. You look at Berlin, 25% social housing. You look at London, 25% social housing. Here in Melbourne, 3.5%. You can't have a society that's got 3.5% social housing. It's a disgrace. And I mean, that's partly why I came over here on a 4-year contract. I was one of your 4, 5, 7 visas that causes its own problems. And I mean, the reason I've stayed here is I've fallen in love with Melbourne as a place. I think it's got a lot of similarities to Glasgow. It's just got more people. But I think the problems and the challenges that Melbourne's got ahead of it, I want to be part of that. I think we're right at a kind of pivotal point where we need to change it, and it's going to be really problematic. And I think there is an opportunity to do it. And I'd probably just to finish on an example, the Glenferro fire tragedy in London. I mean, it's a horrific story, but the impact that's had on grassroots and neighbourhood and community uprising, I've seen 3 huge regeneration projects completely derailed, and they've been called back in, and local councils are having to take ownership of them because there's a lack of trust. It's taken a horrific tragedy for that to happen. But the change that's going on now in terms of social housing, community development, they're just not tolerating the big developer push. And I think that's something that we need to wake up and understand.
We're quickly approaching the end of our first half. It went very quickly for me. I only went through 2 of my questions, but I thought I would end with one of the audience questions actually, and it kind of goes back, Alan, to what you were talking about people fearing that Footscray will become too homogenous. And I thought I'd direct this to you, Santilla, to start off with. Seeing Footscray has such a multicultural, rich history, do you think there's a way for it to gentrify without becoming whitewashed?
Is this being recorded, by the way?
Is it being recorded? Yes.
Look, I think it's a very difficult one because again, the way I look at it is in terms of who can afford to move in, and not everyone that's rich is white, but yes, people that tend to be wealthy majority tend to be white. I guess what I'm most concerned with is when we think about integration and settlement and how people that are arriving in Australia feel welcome and are given a sense of belonging and given a sense of identity, and how well Footscray's been able to do that. And I guess my fear is the loss of that with the changes that are happening. I mean, how do we make sure that, before what Footscray was really good at was, groups would come in, they'd open their own businesses, they'd have communities, And then, you know, once they were settled enough and they were onto their second generation, they'd move out and go somewhere else, and the next wave would come in, and that would keep happening. But at the moment, the possibility of that happening is very difficult because, one, housing is no longer affordable. Even renting in Footscray is incredibly expensive, and if you are someone that comes in as a refugee, being able to rent in an area where you have that close proximity to settlement services, but also access to your community in terms of access to language and all those sorts of things becomes a little bit more difficult. And so your sense of place, your sense of belonging in a city becomes very challenging. And so I think about that in terms of how do we start thinking about how we incorporate people that wouldn't ordinarily be part of the conversation when we're thinking about how does Footscray move forward. And that's a big part for me, because I sort of think that one of the things that Footscray is going to lose the most is that, and we won't have generations that can come in, can start a business. I mean, one of the great things about this suburbs is that, I don't know if any of you have noticed, is just the way that, you know, you go into a shop front and it's in language, it's, you know, at the moment all the election flyers have been translated and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's a great thing because that speaks to how hard Footscray works to integrate people, to give people a sense of belonging, a sense of place, and to sort of think that there are people that are arriving and won't have any of that because it's just no longer accessible is incredibly, incredibly worrying. And so I think, yeah, that's kind of how that's what I fear for in terms of when we talk about gentrification. But do I see, you know, it predominantly being white people moving in terms of people who have wealth and money? Yes, but does that mean that every rich gentrifier is white? No.
Thank you. I think that's a great note to end our conversation on. We'll be back at 7:45 to discuss more on gentrification. Please feel free to get some food and get a drink, and put your hands together for our 5 panellists. Everyone, thanks so much for joining us for our second half. As mentioned, we'll be talking for 45 minutes, after which there'll be a 15-minute audience Q&A, so please start thinking of any questions you would like to ask. We'll just dive straight back into it. So in the course of researching this panel and just my general observations, I've noticed the dialogue around gentrification is rife with problematic language, from former slums turning into blue ribbon suburbs and criminally untapped to going from drab to fab. I wanted to ask all of you, is it possible to talk about the effects and also the aspects of gentrification in terms that don't devalue what Footscray used to be? And if so, how do we do this? Steve, can we start with you?
Sure. We were having a discussion, and I'm going to give an example. And the example is the Olympic Donuts guy. Who had the donut caravan outside Footscray Station for many, many years. And when the Footscray Station upgrade happened, that charming old caravan and, you know, the beautiful dolphin with the nose where he'd make the donut, it went. I think the guy got sick as well, but, you know, he had family who could have carried it on. I mean, I'm not sure of the whole story, but it's an example of you know, a generation that we're beginning to lose. Now, we've touched on how multicultural Footscray is, but what I really want to say is how multi-generational it is also. And when I first moved into Footscray, it was, you know, there was a lot of the old Greek and Italian blokes who weren't afraid to talk to you on the street and tell you how it was and all that sort of stuff. And we're beginning to really lose that. You know, I could speak in the perspective of food, but it's an example of things that we need to cherish and look after in Footscray, as well as encourage, you know, let the new stuff and the old stuff grow hand in hand. The other point I was talking with Alan about in Footscray was the old Saigon market that burnt down a couple of years back. Now, we touched on briefly about, you know, just tons of high density apartments like Duplo blocks being built, like trying to maximise, you know, square meterage for cash. going up along the river there, where we've left a place like the Saigon Market. I used to go there all the time and shop. But it wasn't just shopping, it was, it was the smells of the food, it was the flavour, it was the vision. It was a place where all the community would go and get their stuff. It also supported, any small business families who ran their businesses there, gave the other people jobs around there, and it was a real hub. And nothing's been really done to bring it back. And look, maybe there are plans for it, but the community, or I don't know about it. I live in the community, I'm active in it, and I don't know what's happening there. So, these are examples that we need to look at and learn from in order to, perhaps not put so much value in, knocking shit down and putting high-rises up, but, looking after, particular pillars in the community or people who pioneered and trailblazed in that community, allowing them to grow with the new stuff.
Did anyone else on the panel want to weigh in on the problematic language that's often used to devalue suburbs that undergo gentrification? Karen, did you have something to say?
Well, I guess it's a traditional owner type thing, I guess, for me. When the invaders first came and they came in up the Maribyrnong River and saw all these rolling green hills and the yellow sways of flowers and went, perfect for sheep, oh my God, this is perfect, we've just come to paradise, not even knowing exactly what the space had been cultivated and how traditional owners were farmers in that space and made that space look that way. So I think it's that notion of people coming into a space, the ideas of gentrification or urban renewal as the invaders, and not understanding what's already here and not connecting and belonging to that space, and then knowing it before they jump in and go, we're going to do this and this and this. That's, for me, that's, and yeah, it's a historical thing that white people do. Sorry for white people in the audience, but, it's just that taking over stuff all the time, yeah.
And I think we've talked a lot about how gentrification brings new businesses and new communities to the suburb of Footscray. I was wondering, is there any way that the people who are implicated within the process of gentrification can set up shop in Footscray and I guess in the inner west suburbs more broadly while respecting the defining characteristics of the suburb? What can they do? Santilla, did you want to say anything to start us off?
I'm thinking about it. As you mentioned, I was thinking about it, and I don't necessarily know if I've got an answer at the top of my head. And I guess at this point, I think it would have been, it's useful to think about it from a perspective of business owners that have had businesses in Footscray over the generations and have seen the changes and how they've managed to maintain that. And I saw Tony Cavallaro tonight, and I don't know if he's still here, but he has the best cannoli in the world. He does, he really does.
Yes.
But I mean, the story of how his family set up that business and how just generationally they've been able to keep that as authentic as possible, I think is something that we could all learn from in terms of, groups that want to set up shop in Footscray and how they maintain the authenticity to culture, but also are respectful and mindful of the changes that are going on around them. And I think, over the times that I've spoken to Tony, he's talked about the different changes that have happened in Footscray and how that's impacted his business over the years. And I think when I think about how newer groups come in, the opportunity I think new migrants should have an opportunity to set up businesses when they move to Australia. I think it gives people a sense of, one of the beauties about Saigon Market was that it was a place for the Vietnamese community predominantly to congregate, to have a sense of belonging, to be able to communicate with each other in a land that was very different from their own, but they'd sort of made it their own. And I think that it's important that migrants have spaces where they can do that. And Footscray did that well because the rents were cheap and people could afford it. And I sort of think in terms of going forward, how do we make all those opportunities possible? How is it possible for migrants to set up businesses? And I think those sorts of questions should essentially be answered by people in policy and in government, because I think they're probably best placed to tell us what they're doing in terms of preserving those sorts of things.
Can I maybe I just thinking back to this thing of terminology and jargon, and I mean, one of the big things is city marketing. We've all experienced Melbourne's constant reference to livability, which is completely dubious in terms of the data that's used to, I mean, it's how many museums you have, and it really misses a lot of the social context. But I think one of the things in the context of Footscray that's quite frustrating is that you'll see developers coming in and they'll use Footscray Arts Centre as a point of they'll use it as sales material. You're on the doorstep of, the oldest community arts centre in Australia with, they go on and celebrate all of that, yet they give nothing back to it. Mm-hmm. And I think the problem you've got is that it needs government intervention to make something happen. The only way you can get a social agenda going is to get subsidy. Mm-hmm. And it needs the state government needs to intervene in that. So something like an inclusionary zoning policy is one example where many cities will force developers to contribute through that policy. And I know, I mean, depends on what happens in November, but there is an inclusionary zoning policy that's been written. It's not been launched, and it might appear in the near future.
Can you tell us more about inclusive rezoning for people who are not familiar with that term?
I mean, the whole of New York's been shaped around. I mean, there's a whole different context in terms of global economics over there. But inclusionary zoning means that the developer's got to make a contribution to public good. So whether it's through affordability, so in a London context, for instance, you have to build 40% affordable dwellings as part of any development. It's a kind of mandatory law. So any development, and that obviously controls land price. You don't have anything like that here. And it's the only way you'll get investment in. I mean, what happened in Fisherman's Bend was a criminal act. I'd be as bold to say that. When I get rezoned without any opportunity to get any public good out of it, it was just outrageous. In this day and age, to be allowing a city and a huge swathe of land to fall into the hands of developers like that without any public good is why we've got a bit of a crisis in terms of built form. So typically what happens is the land value gets, it doesn't matter what the land value is, you'll make profit out of it and you'll negotiate upwards. So the product of what you see is plot-based capitalist development. It's pure, it's not about designing for people, it's designing for the market. It's inevitable you're going to get a particular product out of that. So, I wish we could rewind the clock 10 years and have an inclusionary zoning policy for any developer that wants to build in Footscray, give something back to the community, whether it's affordable housing, social infrastructure, parks, open space. And that's how you build.
Or at the very least, build quality. Yeah. I'm hearing stories of people that move into the new apartments, and the builders haven't even put the membranes in the shower, and they're showering, and all the water's just running into the carpet into the next room. I mean, it's not only what you're saying. It's not only cash grabbing. It's just giving poor. It's just poor building, poor craftsmanship.
I mean, I'm sorry to keep going back to places like Berlin, but when I arrived here in 1990, I ended up living in Friedrichshain, which was just in the east. So a lot of people had fled thinking the west was so much better and changed their mind 2 years later. But right on the doorstep was Kreuzberg, biggest Turkish population outside of Turkey, who'd, after World War II had come over, there was a planned major regeneration project in the early 80s in Berlin, and the community of Kreuzberg reacted against it. It was a huge public outcry, and they managed to change government policy, and they ended up with it was called I think it's termed now careful redevelopment or something like that. But the community played a huge part in the redevelopment process. So it was urban infill. They didn't demolish. There was a proposal to demolish and rebuild with new builds. And they got rent caps in place. And those rent caps allowed gentrification to happen, but slowly. And it protected existing tenants. Landlords couldn't change the rent structure. And that was secured right up until 2005, and when they deregulated, the whole of Berlin changed. And literally now, if you look at Kreuzberg, it's a creative class that's in there. It's all a kind of young creatives. It's a completely different place now. Overnight land value just rocketed. So it needs regulation of some sort to protect the rents. And there needs to be, I think it's a state government intervention.
I guess
Karen, do you want to chip in?
I was just sort of thinking while you were talking, Andrew, around public good and the ways in which it's not just about state government. I think there's some major ways that community who live in Footscray, who are passionate about Footscray, can have some really good conversations with the City Council, with Footscray Community Arts Centre, with Victoria University, with the Bulldogs. These are sort of major institutions, I guess, if you like, in the West, and to be able to harness them in a way, VU's really keen about creating this Footscray University town, in conjunction with the Bulldogs and Maribyrnong City Council. We also have a partnership with the Footscray Community Arts Centre, and it'd be great to sort of, find some positive space that you can have a conversation about how community can get involved and what that means for them and how they can have a voice in that space, and get those major players to, push back against the ways that, state government planning hasn't quite got there yet, although we hope that they will if they, those sorts of things come into play.
That segues beautifully into my next question, which is really about, more broadly, did any of you have thoughts on how businesses, sport venues and community venues can work to support sensitive and culturally appropriate development and bring together communities in this time of flux? Izzy, I thought I'd start with you. From a sporting perspective, what does a new women's league mean to Footscray, and what work do the Western Bulldogs do in the Footscray community?
Yeah, so as I spoke about before, the Western Bulldogs are particularly prominent in their work in the community, and I think they're very different to most other football clubs in the work that they do, in the value that they place on the people of Footscray and the different demographics, and now more recently the women who have just started playing, and they have been one of the clubs that has truly embraced the Women's League, and they were one of the foundation clubs that started back in 2013 before any other football clubs had started playing games with women, and they started a team, and the whole club from the top down has been so embracing of us, and they've really brought us into the community, and I've felt the love from the community and the club, and I feel really privileged to be a part of it. But at the same time, I feel being part of the Footscray Football Club and the work that the Dogs do, we have a responsibility to also give back to the community, and I think that they do that really well. There's a number of community programs that the Dogs hold and invest into, and we've got the Western Bulldogs Community Foundation, which has these programs and has been running for a very long time and really helps out that community. So, there are the men's health programs, there are now women's health programs. I think in the 9 years that they've had a refugee settlement program, they've assisted 18,000 refugees in that process of settlement or in the Footscray area, which I find quite remarkable, and it allows not only the people of Footscray to get involved, but the players as well to give back. For me to have that opportunity to be involved and give back to the community is really powerful, and I think it's something I really want to capitalise on and be able to be involved with for a very long time. So, I think often people see sport, the perception around it is it's just a game and it's just something you play, but for me and for the club it's so much more than that, and it's the way that you can change people's perceptions about women, about equality, about the LGBTI community, about refugees, about so many different topics and so many different sort of marginalised people, and I think the club's doing really well in that space, and there are plans for sort of redevelopment of the Wynnum Oval space as well to become more community oriented and build more public spaces. It's one of the few AFL training grounds that is open to the public, so we're out training, we love seeing people, families walking around with their dogs and kids, and just really getting involved in the club and using the space that we have for the better.
Thanks,
And
Izzy.
they're going to put up flagpoles and fly the Aboriginal flag very shortly. Yes. Sorry.
Have any of you been involved in similar community-led efforts to kind of push back against this, the negative effects of gentrification that manifest in mindless investments and developer-led projects and things like that?
So I suppose one of the things I've been involved with, and it's not Footscray, it's Wyndham, because, yeah, Footscray is the Indigenous Advisory Group with Footscray Community Arts Centre, but in Wyndham City Council area, there's a number of Aboriginal people there who have moved into that space, who are from the Stolen Gens, and they know they're Aboriginal, but that's about it. And as I was saying earlier, you know, the importance of having a space together and to be self-determining and to be sovereign is really important for Aboriginal people. So one of the things I've been heavily involved in that space, working with Wyndham City Council, is to actually build an Aboriginal community centre, which is an integrated centre which has a childcare and kindergarten and a neighbourhood hub and those sorts of things. And those things are really important to community cohesion, community connection, and community belonging. And I think what Footscray has, which is maybe not quite the same, but I think what it does really well is those sort of business associations that, you know, the Vietnamese group, and there's a Vietnamese African one that work really well together. And they come together in spaces, and I think that's the importance about creating those spaces that you can push back against. If you have a space to come and gather and talk about what's happening, you can push back and have those conversations with the other people who are around, like Melbourne City Council, or push back against state government, to voice your own opinions and say, well, this is what's happening, this is how it's affecting us, and don't do this, it's not good for this community. Those sorts of spaces are really important to enable a dynamic space where people can create change and engage with other people to sort out who's where and who's not, and understand each other in cultural spaces. That's really important. And I think, that's the sort of work I've been doing in Wyndham, but it's also the work that Footscray Community Arts Centre does really well in this space as well. I think I just went inside out and back to front there, but that's what. Sorry.
Steve, do you see a way for new businesses that come to Footscray to work together with all businesses, and how best can that be done?
It's a good question. I think the day and age we're in now in terms of small business or food businesses, I can't speak too much on other businesses, but it's becoming more and more insular, and I think even society, we're becoming more and more individual. And this is a broader topic. I don't want to start like letting my head, like let you guys inside my head about the theories I have about people on mobile phones and earplugs, and how, you know, we're losing the sense of family, like at that core level, let alone communities within businesses, and how, you know, we're being almost governed to become individuals, so we're easier to govern. Anyway.
Good point.
I think social media is a really good tool to create those communities and communicate within those. I think everyone that's made the effort to come here to listen and show interest in what's happening in this area is a great start. So, you know, what we're doing here is a really good, you know, first step for some people, you know, more of a step for others. I don't know the answer exactly to your question, but I hope I've shed some light in terms of what I think about it.
Sure, thank you. To switch tact slightly, I know we've talked a bit about the constructive things that have come out of increased investment into an area, like I guess we can think about the upgrade of the Footscray station. How do we kind of balance talking about the positive effects of increased government infrastructure in an area while also not ignoring the social and human costs of things like gentrification? Alan or Santilla, did you want to weigh in?
I don't think you can separate the two. I don't think you can have this sort of conversation without thinking about the human cost. I'll just pick up on the previous question that you asked, and I think just in terms of new businesses that have set up and are kind of working with older businesses, the example that comes to my mind is Steve, who owns Littlefoot Bar. I don't know if any of you have been there, but he moved in a couple of years ago, and one of the things that he did, because he knew that he wasn't from the community, was to sort of, one, immerse himself with the local businesses. And I think one of the things that they did was they set up a collective where they helped older businesses that had been around to modernise, and they set up this directory, which was to kind of ensure that these older businesses weren't, losing out because of the waves of gentrification. I think he's, revived the Trugo Club and all this sort of stuff. And so there are things that I think local businesses can do in partnership with older businesses to ensure that that it's still maintained. But I think in talking about how do we celebrate the things that gentrification brings, which are good things. I mean, when you do have new roads and infrastructure and cafes that sell turmeric lattes, it's not necessarily all that bad. But there is a serious consequence, because it is people that can't ordinarily afford to live and work in an area are further pushed out, and I don't think that we can have that conversation without thinking about those impacts. And it's a difficult conversation to have, because I think the people that are best placed to answer those questions are people in policy, because they're the people that are making the decisions that will have long-term impacts on this area. And I mean, even in terms of thinking about all the solutions, just hearing Alan talking about some of the things that needs to be implemented, it all starts with policy. And as much as we can try to push back, I think at this stage it's more of how do we manage gentrification rather than, because the developer's already here. I mean, you just have to look up and there are cranes everywhere. So it's not like they're going anywhere. They've brought their money, and they will do with it as they please. But without things like regulation and how developments go up, and the fact that there isn't any diversity within the buildings that are being built, it's very difficult for individuals and smaller businesses to really fight back from that, because what do you do? And it's just a very complicated area to be getting into to think about. But I guess my thing is that you cannot talk about what's happening without thinking about the people that are being pushed out, the people that are losing access to services, the people that can no longer afford to live in the area, and then what that then does to how this suburb looks like in the next 10 to 15 years.
That's great. And that reminds me of a really interesting audience question we received, which was, do you think government should compensate existing residents who get pushed out of a suburb because of gentrification? If so, why? If not, why not?
I don't think they should be compensating. I think they should be figuring out how to keep people in the suburb. Like, I just think, why compensate people for moving them from their home? It's just I think, you start to lose your character when you lose the people. Like, compensate them and then what? I just don't think that's a great solution.
There's a couple of things you could do really simply. The problem with some of these developments is that part of the planning criteria is you write a design impact statement. It means nothing really. There's no, you might get called into the Office for the Victorian Government Architect, but they have no mandatory power to change the design. The developer can just get up and walk out. So planning becomes a really difficult negotiation with the developer. At the very most, you might get asked to do an environmental impact statement, given its proximity to water or the river or landscape. No one ever asks you to do a social impact statement, which I think is bizarre, given the consequences of some of these developments. So in some places that is just, day one you're asked to provide an economic impact statement, a design impact statement, environmental impact statement, and a social impact statement. And, it sounds like so many layers of bureaucracy, and I'm sure a lot of the architects and developers out there would be cringing at me saying, add more bureaucracy into the process. But given the consequences of these developments, I think it's absolutely essential. And then I think you go back, you mentioned infrastructure. I find it incredible that we can find money for roads. We can find money for, land remediation when it's got an environmental agenda. Housing is not seen as infrastructure, but it should be. It's social infrastructure. Why can't we find the money to build affordable housing? And I think that's the crux of this. housing to me is the backdrop of gentrification.
Yes, we were talking about this before the panel and how it's impossible to talk about what's happening in Footscray without talking about housing affordability and how, I guess, the unaffordable prices have also caused a lot of renters to come to Footscray and what that has done to prices. I wanted to touch on that, and I was wondering, Alan, if you could talk to us about, is it possible to sustain the appeal of the suburb of Footscray, evident in the higher property prices, while also keeping it affordable to longer-term residents?
No, I think, look, that goes back to just some of these policy shifts. I mean, look, government know this. I mean, if you look at that document, the housing, what was it called? Housing the All Victorians, I think it was, that was published a couple of years ago. At least it tried to, there was an attempt to define what affordability meant, and it means different things to different people. But I think that moved the conversation on dramatically. The problem here is the 4-year cycle of government. You get 2 years of initiative and positive discussion, and then 2 years of panic leading up to an election. And that's just ridiculous. So hopefully next year, when things settle down, we'll find another swathe of policy coming through. And I know for a fact that government, Labour government, are looking at these things seriously. So I think there is potential for some of this to change. And it needs that policy to transform the current condition, because it is developer-led, monetised building purely to make money. It's not for people. We're not designing for people. We're designing to make profit. And I think, I mean, you look at the development along the road, and apologies to anyone that lives in that development, but if anyone knew that's what they were proposing to build, I'm sure the community would have been up and, I mean, to build a car park at street level and turn your back on the community and then build a fence around it. I mean, that's just basic. If I had a student doing that, I'd be failing them. So I can't believe that in this day and age we're allowing developers to do that. It's not appropriate design.
Alan, do you know? Sorry to cut you off.
Okay.
Those areas where those high rises are going up, do you know, was that state land that the state sold to the developers? Do you know if that's
No,
the case?
not all. I mean, look, that's another issue. I mean, we have a lot of state-owned land in Victoria.
And then undersold it for what the true value is anyway, or undersold what the current square metre value is anyway for different forms of...
Look, I think what I would say, I mean, I do think there is a bit of a... We need to really take this seriously, because, I mean, Footscray, you only have to look at a map and its proximity to the city. Not only that, the topography, the river, the views, it is distinctive in a Melbourne setting. Forget about, you know, the amazing cultural diversity of the place. Just as a developer looking around, you know, for development land, the land's slightly cheaper, or it has been over the last 10 to 20 years in comparison to other parts of Melbourne. So it's rich pickings. You start buying up individual plots, you suddenly get scale, you lose the grain, the fine grain of a place. And that's the thing that worries me. I think you're going to end up with a generic part of Melbourne, and they'll capitalise on the views. That's why these developments are building on the riverside. It's marketing. It's a river view, a city view and a river view. So I think there's a real concern for me about it's plot-based urbanism where they focus on a red line boundary around the plot and don't care what happens outside of it. And we need a broader neighbourhood and community agenda, and we need to get these developers to sit down and talk about what they're planning to do and find a way of... I mean, the other thing about, I mean, some of the small businesses, that small grain, I think, is a critical issue. It's why the city centre of Melbourne is unique, because of the small grain. We're now moving to agents demanding bigger floor plates, shop fronts, 80% glass and transparency, and it's just, you see it here, and you'll see it here in Footscray, you'll see it in parts of Fitzroy now. We're losing that small grain as the high street starts to change, and you lose the heritage of it, the physical heritage, the social heritage. So we really need to get on top of this.
Yeah. Karen, did you want to weigh in?
Just on a few things. So I guess that stuff around the bureaucratic complexities of planning, you know, if you look at the Victorian government and what they did around the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Act, and how the cultural heritage management plans now sit on top of planning and development, and so what developers then have to do to get to that space. So the question around adding more onto that shouldn't be a thing not to go to that space, but yeah, it does really need to be done, and it does need to be done in a way, yeah, that takes into the community amenity of places.
Yeah.
You know, you look at the State Trustees building here at Footscray and you sort of go, what were they thinking? How? You know, it's just a really ugly space, and I don't know how much of that space is filled or how long that will be filled for, but, you know, there's sort of the design of getting that building just sprung up out of there. And I guess the other thing I was sort of wondering about is that sort of notion around the training of people coming into these spaces, so the training of people around who are in planning and devising the policy around planning, and the people who are becoming other architects, I guess, and because you don't train to become a developer, do you? You just have money, you just go, I'm going to do it anyway. But I don't know. See, anyway. But those sorts of things around that whole conversation around how all of those players can actually sit in a room and have that. You know, I think that's a really great point that you made. That just then, you know, that, and that should be enabled from the ground up in some way. I don't know if that's possible. Probably not. You know, but in terms of government regulations and that sort of stuff, I would like to see more of those sort of regulations come on top. Because if you can do it for blackfellas around cultural heritage, then you know you should be able to do it about the amenity of a community and what's important in that space.
So we have 10 minutes to go. Please start thinking about any questions you may have, which brings me to my final question. As you said, Santilla, gentrification can't be stopped. We have developer-led apartments just around the corner, and it's been in motion for so long, but it's clear that we need to find a way to protect the communities and cultural heritage that still very much exists in Footscray. My final question was about, do you think cities can be both regenerated and inclusive at the same time? And if so, how?
Are you asking me?
Everyone,
Okay.
but you can weigh in first.
I think they can, but I think it takes effort from everyone. I think in thinking about gentrification, I mean, Alan hit it on the head when he said that, you know, this is a conversation about housing, and I think it's thinking about all of us. I mean, how do we think about the cities that we want to live in, that we want to grow old in? What do we want them to look like? And I think that there is a responsibility at all the levels, whether it's a government level down to the individual level. And I think, you know, from a policy level, I mean, there are things that Alan has flagged that I think should be considered, and we should be demanding from people that are in government to be thinking about and to be putting measures in place in order for our cities to remain sustainable. I think diversity is a great thing for cities, and not just cultural diversity, but, you know, when we're talking about age, when we're talking about social economics, and it's thinking about how do we have housing that sort of better reflects all of that and ensures that there are people that come from working class backgrounds and can still see roots in Footscray and can still see an opportunity to make something of themselves in a city, because that's what cities do. I mean, even if you don't have access to certain things, there should at least be the opportunity to think that you can, if you work hard, be able to access it. But if you're pushed out from all of that, where you left, and I think these are things we should be thinking about. I think one of the things that we culturally have a problem with in this country is the obsession of owning land and owning our homes. I think that really impacts how cities are going to look in the future, because I think if we start, I mean, Alan just talked about the model in London where you know, it's incorporating within housing structures people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, you know, in spaces where wealthier people can live. And I think thinking about the diversity and how buildings are structured in that way is a great thing to be thinking about in terms of long-term sustainability of the diversity of communities. I am a very big fan of community-led sort of land trusts where, you know, communities come in and buy up spaces and ensure that, you know, you can control the rent and you can ensure that people that have lived in that area can stay in that area. And I think it really is about all of us sort of having that responsibility in terms of thinking about what we would like Footscray to be like going forward, and how all those levels come together, whether it's at the government level down to the individual level. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
It's amazing, thank you. Did the rest of the panel want to weigh in as well on how cities can be regenerated but inclusive at the same time?
Look, I've got to I probably sound like I've been a pessimist all night, so I'm very optimistic. I think there is signs across Melbourne that things are happening. I mean, we're doing some work with Moorland Council. They've got community land trusts. They're starting to look at things like their car parks, surface car parks, and all the air rights. I mean, you know, the future of the car becomes a big question mark. You know, so we're launching a project called Virtual Moorland in the beginning of November as a planning tool. So we're modelling, you know, potential development based on their planning regulations, but using the community land trust model as an engagement tool for the community to try and understand what could happen in a space. I think there's some really good examples of housing that's starting to, and believe it or not, some of them are led by architects who cut the developer out. Things like Nightingale, that's happening predominantly around Brunswick. The Assemble model, it's a 7-year rental to buy. And I think that's one of the things we need to start to educate the communities about what's possible. The market is vulnerable. I think there's shifts coming. The rental market is going to increase, I think. But again, for me as an architect, I think there's a real need for diversity in what's been offered in terms of housing. I don't think the quality, the size is appropriate. I think there needs to be a much stronger agenda coming from local councils about quality and appropriateness.
Did anyone else have any final parting thoughts? No? Well, let's bring it to the audience Q&A. Please put your hand up if you have a question, and there'll also be a roving mic.
And turn the lights on, yes.
Go doggies.
Slip that in there. Go. Thank you. My name's Kate. I'm going to take the opportunity to make a comment because I just think I came here as a Footscray resident wanting to ensure that affordable housing is part of this conversation. I think it's integral to ensuring the inclusiveness and diversity of Footscray and Maribyrnong and the Inner West more broadly. And I'm part of a residents group called Housing AIM that's putting on a forum on the 1st of November specifically on that topic. So I just wanted to give a plug for our forum and for everyone in this room to come along and learn more about affordable housing and what solutions can be put in place to ensure that change is not a bad thing, that we can have positive aspects around increased housing supply, but it has to include more affordable housing for a diverse range, particularly our lower income residents. So grab a flyer and come along. It's at Yarraville Club on the 1st of November from 6 till 8 p.m. There's flyers by the door, or you can find us Housing AIM on Facebook.
Thank you. Did anyone else have any questions?
Mine didn't go too far. So I actually live in the northern suburbs, and I live in the city of Moorland, and I run food tours in the area because I grown up in a migrant family, an Italian family, and I know that there are lots of really amazing food offerings from those small family businesses that don't get recognition in some of the popular forums. So actually, I'm so happy, Alan, that you're already talking to the Moorland Council, because I was going to come up to you and get your business card and go and give it to them and tell them that they have to talk to you. But just about your question earlier about how can new businesses learn from the older businesses coming into the area and learning from the older businesses. Well, something that I've noticed that when I speak to business owners is that many people don't even know the history of the area or know the history of the building that they're in. And that's, I think, is a real important start. Like when new immigrants come to the country, they're expected to sit a test so that they can fit in and show that they know where they are, Australia, and that they can fit in. But I think it's also important for new business owners or all business owners to at least know the history of where they are and the buildings that they're in. and also talking to existing business owners and the older people in the community who have been there for years, and ask them, well, you know, what is the story of this place and what is the culture of this place, and how can my new business honour that and also contribute to that as well. So, yeah.
That's really good points. I like that. Yeah. We can talk to, I don't know, there should be some follow-up. Maybe along City Council, you know, what are we going to do? Let's take some action.
Well, I was thinking about the question I said I couldn't answer.
Go on then.
And while we were talking about the property and the housing and the community and stuff, the word community I was thinking about, you know, it can just start by simply getting out there and going into those businesses and trying their food and talking to them, or buying something and talking to them, or just interacting on a day-to-day basis as an individual. That's one place you can start by, you know, by creating a community. So your point that you just raised there is a very good one.
I think so too.
Do we have a question at the back?
Yeah, it feels a bit crazy to ask this question now because we have like 2 minutes left. But there's like, just to question the idea about policy, and like, there's been lots of talk about policy, but I think like when we're talking about some of the upgrades that have happened because of policy from the government, like say for the Footscray train station, the Footscray train station got upgraded, but also meant like police checkpoint, like Footscray police station is now, like Footscray station is now like a police checkpoint. You know, like that came with that upgrade, and because like the agenda of government is not just to upgrade it, they also have other agendas. And so like I just think that kind of ask a question to the panel about how we can think about resisting or challenging gentrification from the community level rather than relying or trusting in government, when we have a lot of evidence that people from the panel and the community would know that like government's interests are pro-business and pro-development, and like in a big way, and that sometimes you can kind of convince them to do something for the community, but how long will that actually last? And then 4 years the government will change, and you know, like what then happens next? And so I just wanted to ask what people think about how the community level can challenge gentrification.
I think that's a great question. In terms of government, I think, I mean, the way I was talking about it, and I think this is how Alan was thinking about it, was just the lack of policy in these areas, not what's already in place, which is what we were talking about in that instance. I completely agree with you in terms of just the policing that's happening in Footscray. It's part and parcel of gentrification, you know, to give the area a sense of safety and safe, you know, people that are coming in, they can feel like they're not going to get robbed or whatever. Other fears that come with coming from a wealthy area that you might have of, you know, people that live on the west side of town, I don't know. But in terms of what can people do, like I said, I think, and I think Steve touched on this before, I mean, when he was reluctant to enter philosophical territory with his view about how, as society, we are becoming more insular and moving towards that very individual way of living. I think that when we think about our suburbs, I think we definitely have to be thinking about the responsibility that each of us plays in how we contribute. And if that is from the very basic things that you can do, which is just going to the local businesses, supporting local businesses, that's one thing that you can do. There's things, I think a lot of community groups here have a lot of initiatives. The Community Arts Centre have space for people to come in and interact and give back to the community. So if you wanted to be more proactive in that sense, there are definitely organisations that can assist. One of the things that I've been thinking about in the space that I work in, because I deal with stories, I tell stories for a living, is because I know that gentrification's happening, but I'm thinking about the people that will be most impacted by it, and that's people from underrepresented groups, that's low socioeconomic backgrounds, that's LGBTIQ people, people from culturally diverse backgrounds. And because I know that there is very little that I can do outside of having decent policy that ensures that there is a diversity of housing that allows for people to be represented physically in Footscray, how do I keep people coming to Footscray and interacting with Footscray? And stories are a big part of that for me. And so one of the things that I started with the Community Arts Centre here was an initiative, an annual initiative, just to get a lot of people from these groups being able to tell their stories and share their stories and be able to document those things, because I think documenting and archiving stories of an area are important for people that are coming in later on. And that's one way that I think about it with what I do for a living. I think that there's certainly things that we can all be thinking about in terms of how we ensure that Footscray doesn't lose that, its identity in the face of all of these changes. But a lot of it still does come from the top. I think a lot of the things that will determine what Footscray looks like in 15 years' time come down to policy, unfortunately. Like if we don't have decent policy in place, it's hard, even in the face of good intentioned citizens, to see how we can push back.
Yeah, it's a good point, mate. Our only voice is voting, and voting for a particular person who's holding that seat, and then understanding what their policy might be or what their agenda is, and then from the example of the federal election, you vote one bloke in and the other bloke stabs him in the back, and then you got a new prime minister every time,
But look, and I think an important thing don't underestimate the power of this. The power of Footscray Arts Centre actually as a community, and as a space to bring. I think it's part of the conversation we're having about this precinct plan. You can't change everything, but we can at least trying to influence some of the decisions and engage in a conversation. So the whole idea would be to invite developers in rather than see them as the enemy. Bring them in and educate them, talk to them, without... some of the times that we get these tensions, it becomes a fight and a battle. And I think it's about trying to have a conversation about some of the decisions that are going on. And we can't expect that everyone's going to get, people in council are always going to get it right. They don't fully understand everything that's going on at community level. So I'm really hopeful that things could change if the dialogue can start to happen. The problem in some of these organisations, people come and go. You sometimes get positive things happening with an individual comes into an organisation. I look at Sunshine. The person that was leading the planning down at Sunshine for about 4 or 5 years was an incredible person. Sadly, he's gone. He's gone into the city of Melbourne. But the amount of positive change that happened because of one individual taking an active leadership role in the community and caring about what was built is significant. So I think there's a huge opportunity as a community to start to influence and shape things.
And I think following on from that, what I've sort of found as a black person in working with government in all different layers of government is that the amount of times that we've rallied together as community from community-based organisations and that voice, which is what this community can also do, is that we've now got to a stage where state government in particular talks so much about co-design. And so whatever it is they're going to do around programs or policies or anything, it's a co-design conversation. That's not a short-term fix, it's a long-term fix. It's taken us over 200 years to get to that sort of space. But these things are possible if you have a good, strong community voice and you're willing to be proactive and bring people along with you from the community to influence those sorts of spaces. And, it's a really good space to be if you can twist it in that way.
I don't think I could have asked for a nicer note for this panel to end on. If you're interested in what else the Footscray Community Arts Centre does as a program at reception, and if you want to show off your West Side pride, they're selling West Side t-shirts at reception for $25. Please put your hands together for the panellists, and thank you for coming tonight.